New changes to Foxhole have changed the game's economy, and players can't decide if they love it or hate it. Resources have become 5 times more abundant, making everything in the game easier to access for all players and cheaper. You might ask yourself, why would players be upset by this? And that's a great question to ask. When I first heard about the changes that were coming to resources and the facilities, I thought it would be a positive for the community. After the dev stream was over, players took to Reddit and the community was split between whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. Now we're 25 days into War 112 and players still can't decide if it's a good or bad thing. From what I can tell, solo players love this new change and players and clans hate it. Let's dive into the pros and cons, and you can decide for yourself if this change is good for Foxhole or if it makes it worse. Resources are now gathered 5 times faster than they previously were gathered before. Salvage is overflowing at the fields. Basic materials and explosive materials are constantly being capped in refineries. Most salvage mines are capped out at 5k for several hours a day, and most of the time have containers near them full of salvage as well. The problem may not be the amount of salvage available, but the ability to move it efficiently. The 5 times addition in the economy makes it easier to gather materials and produce things like basic materials, explosive materials, and refined materials. This means that players can spend less time gathering materials and more time sending items and vehicles to the front where they are needed. There is no more resource scarcity and players are fighting less over these resources. Is the lack of scarcity in resources breaking the economy in Foxhole? This is the question we need to ask ourselves. Foxhole is ran on the macro and micro level, which I don't think a lot of players think about that often. 5 times the resources means faster tech from more field spawning, more equipment, more artillery, and more tanks. It's like when you play StarCraft and you've maxed out your unit limit and your upgrades. Your resources start to stack and you can't use your resources until you lose your units. And once you do lose your units, you just resupply them immediately on the front with your overflowing resources that you had banked. I think this overall resource change has helped solo players do more. Tanks are more accessible to solo players now more than ever. Clan man might think that is bad, but I think this is an overall net positive for the game. I also like the idea of not having to camp a component field. Resource scarcity looks good on paper as a challenge the players need to overcome, but it does not fit well with the current pace of how wars play out right now. With increased resources, we have increased production. Because players now have to spend less time gathering, it means they have more time to build equipment and vehicles. Because of the high return on resources, the actual labor, time, and energy put into getting the resources has gone way down. Now all that labor, time, and energy can be spent on other aspects of the game. We are seeing this in the current war with more artillery and tanks than we'd ever seen before. I've talked with players that have never produced a tank before, and now they are mass producing tanks in the factories. They are able to go and have fun on the front and waste less time in the backline. Now, is this good or bad for the game? Maybe it's too early to tell since this is the first war with these new changes. It's joked already that late game in Foxhole is World of Tanks, but it would seem with these new changes that this is even more the case now and tanks are all over the place. Some players think that the constant tank battles are fun, and other players think that tanks can now be replaced too easily. There was a time when tanks were a lot more valuable. You wouldn't just yeet your tank in the battle because you normally spent a lot of time gathering the materials and bringing the tank to the front. But now with so many tanks in the storage, you can easily full send a tank into battle and just go get another one. Now again, the question is this good or bad? I feel like there's a lot of pros and cons on each side. We are about 25 days into the war and we have already seen a lot of super heavy tanks. In previous wars, we may have seen 2 or 3 super heavy tanks about now, but now we are seeing more like 20 or 30 super heavy tanks. We could get to a stage where the super heavy tanks lose their prestige. Then the devs would need to come out with a higher tech tank that costs even more. Don't get me wrong, I honestly love seeing more battle tanks and super heavy tanks, especially as we get into the really late war. But I still do think they need to be more valuable and not something you can just throw away. It should feel awful to lose one of those tanks on the front. And if you do lose one of those tanks on the front, then the other team should be able to punish you for that. Foxhole felt great when you killed a tank and you knew it was hard for your opponent to replace it. But we've gone away from that with the new changes. I think we still need that feeling in Foxhole though. If we don't address this concern about making tanks feel valuable, then we will start to lose the strategic nature of Foxhole as well. There needs to be some risk and reward when using these higher tech vehicles. I think we can all agree that these changes are catering more to solo players, as these solo players don't have to spend as much time gathering the resources to build these vehicles. But is this harming other groups or other players in Foxhole? Though arty shells were already in high abundance before this update, the resource changes have made it easier for smaller groups to make ammo facilities. So though it may not seem like the amount of shells has changed, I believe the amount of players participating in arty has changed, which is why we're seeing a lot more artillery during this war. I'm all for things becoming more accessible for smaller groups in Foxhole. I love that the devs are starting to lean more into this with their updates, but we need to consider when we buff one area of Foxhole, we need to be concerned about the other areas that are affected. The players that are suffering the most from these changes, I believe, are infantry and builders. With more tanks on the front, it's harder for infantry to move around and make any notable changes. Infantry players are getting hit by more arty and hit by more tank ammo shots because there's so much of it now. Tank lines used to be reserved about firing their shells at infantry, and now they do it without blinking an eye.
I think I can proudly say that I saved Robert.
You have more scenarios like Weathered Expanse where it's literally just become World of Tanks. You have more players sitting in the tanks because it usually takes 2 to 3 players to operate these tanks, which means there's going to be less infantry on the ground helping the push move forward. I won't get into it in this video, but that is where I think the population per hex is an issue as well. Infantry simply needs more anti-tank equipment options for the late game. Otherwise, there's no purpose for being an infantry player when tanks can do the same job but better. I might as well get a tank in the public seaport in the back and just bring it up and start firing. I personally feel like me getting a sticky or a flask off on a tank should be a big deal. It shouldn't feel like a little bug bite to the tank. Now, I don't know what specifically kind of change we should make for this anti-tank equipment, but that is my general opinion on infantry versus tanks. Now for the other group that suffers from this change, builders. Builders before this update were already having issues with burnout. With more arty and tank span, it's much harder for builders to keep their bases up. While replacing concrete might be easier now with more resources, destroying it has become easier as well. Concrete is the new standard for every base, and concreting daily is now the builder's sole purpose in life. By making the concrete so accessible, they have actually punished the builders. If we are going to make concrete so obtainable, where is my concrete mixer truck? Come on, devs. You even have the concept art and everything. It's in the game files, I know it. Just give us the cement truck. Builders are getting burnt out. We need this. There's no point in spending hours to build a concrete base only to have it washed away in less than an hour. The devs unfortunately have not had any updates for bases since we started having these longer wars. I believe there needs to be a higher tech for bases in the late game. A tech that helps fortify against arty specifically. And of course, if you tech down this specific tree, maybe you make sacrifices in other areas with your base's defenses. I'm not quite sure what that looks like, but I still would like a specific option to tech in to fortify against artillery. While we're talking about tech, I think it takes too much time to tech bases. With the current pace that wars go, I think teching bases takes way too long. I would like to see the tech pace change become a little bit faster the longer the war goes on. And I don't know if this is because of the changes, but War 112 has been a lot of fun with back and forth battles on the fronts. Instead of some fronts just getting steamrolled and never seeing a battle in that hex again, each faction is able to push back, which I think is great. I would guess it is because of the influx of tanks and arty, and that's why we're seeing more of these types of battles. The defensive buildings can't get built in time, so the tanks and the arties just keep pushing each other back and forth, and I think we're going to keep seeing these front lines swing back and forth. I might be the only person that thinks this, but I love these battles that go back and forth. I love that a faction can get pushed out of the hex and then come back the next day and push the other faction almost completely out of the hex as well. Players are calling it a slugfest, but shouldn't that be what the front line is about? I don't really care for wars where a hex gets steamrolled and we never see battles there the rest of the war. There are stalemates happening on the front, but it's not because of defensive structures. It's actually, in my opinion, because of the tanks and the artillery. This is a new kind of stalemate that I don't think most Foxhole players are used to. Overall, I think anything that reduces the grind is a good thing for Foxhole. The game should be more about fighting on the front and delivering supplies to the front. It should be less about gathering the materials and waiting for those items or vehicles to be built. The less time I can spend whacking my hammer against salvage and actually work on getting supplies to the front, the more fun I'm having with the game. Burnout, in my opinion, is the #1 problem that makes Foxhole players stop playing. If we can prevent any kind of burnout in any way, I think it's a win for Foxhole players. I thought the devs wanted these changes because the resources were being hoarded by clans too much and they wanted to give us the ability to work together more. I honestly see more clans dumping excess resources into public instead of hoarding the resources until the very end of the war. As a logi player, I find it very disheartening to see huge stockpiles be released when it's too late for any of those resources to get used at the end of a war. I'm glad that groups are releasing these resources before that time comes.
The idea of the war factory is taking the next step towards public logistics. We really want people to enjoy Foxhole without having to spend hours and hours and hours making vehicles. So even though DevMan came out with this patch where making public logi is a lot easier, when you leave it in the hands of people that specialize in making logistics, it basically allows us to do something like a war factory, where we can make a lot of vehicle variants so people can have specific vehicles to achieve certain things during pushes. Now, unfortunately, and this is one of the downsides of playing on the Colonial side, most of our main battle vehicles are facility locked. So most of the Warden vehicles are easily just created in a mass production factory and then deployed in a storage depot, and then everyone can go grab a free tank and put shells in it and go to the front. So unfortunately for the Colonials, our main battle tanks, which is the Spatha and the light tank destroyer as well as some additional sundry assistance vehicles like the Rancier, as well as the Scorpion, all require a very large facility to be built. And it's not just the facility requirement, you actually need to build a lot of supporting facilities to produce all the different assembly materials to make these vehicles. And for the average player to run 4 or 5 facilities to have a vehicle pad fully supported is quite daunting. So what we at WL did is we kind of sat down and said, okay, we really want to build a lot of mass production main battle tanks, which is the Spatha, the light tank destroyer, etc. So we decided on building a smallish facility 1 hex just away from the front line to build these vehicles en masse for public use, as well as provide anyone the opportunity to bring their own vehicle that they can hammer out at a garage, or if they are a regiment, they can bring their own sort of trainload or truckload of crated vehicles, deploy it in a nearby storage depot, and then spend a little bit of time just driving the vehicles onto the pads, making the appropriate upgrades, and then either storing them for operational use or just immediately drive them to the front and go fight. So, of course, we didn't want to just make a facility and allow anyone else to do it. We've also been making use of our extended refined material queues to mass produce a lot of battle tanks for the Colonial faction, and we've been doing large-scale vehicle deployments, not only to the local storage depot, which we're using to deploy vehicles from here, but we've also been running trains to all the fronts, where trains are just offloading upgraded vehicles, some veterancy vehicles as well as the usual WL container yard, which produces all the ammunition and supporting equipment for the fronts. So the main idea for the War Factory is everyone has an opportunity to play with all the toys in the Colonial faction, but we also provide a large amount of main battle tanks for the front and specialist equipment to deal with certain tasks and give the Wardens a bit of a headache whenever we show up at a front.
Clanman does not like to hear this, but this game needs to be more balanced for casual players. It doesn't need to cater completely to casual players, but there needs to be a balance. I know most vets think that all casual players do is join the front line for an hour and shoot at people and then log off, but that's because everything else takes too much time. Now, because these casual players spend less time gathering, they're actually able to do more with logistics. And because they have to spend less time gathering to get a tank, they can actually get a tank and join the front lines as well. So of course, with more resources, they're going to have more options to do more things. They won't have to just log on for an hour and shoot people as an infantry player. They can actually get in tanks and do things. If we can reduce that time by only a small amount by making gathering resources easier, then I see this as more of a win for casual players to get into tanking and artillery experiences. Things that I think should take a long time in Foxhole are still fighting over territory and delivering supplies. Those time constraints should not be changed. Gathering and time to build, in my opinion, should be shorter because they are the least fun parts of the game. Any decrease in the amount of effort a solo player needs to make is a direct decrease in the amount of time a clanman player needs to make as well. I think if you're in a clan and you're mad about these changes, I think you need to take a look at the bigger picture. This is a team-based game, and that means working with everyone and not just your specific group. Sometimes you will need to work with other clans and other random solo players. That, in my opinion, is how Foxhole should work. This war is not over yet, but unless one side completely burns out, I foresee this war easily going into 40 or 45 days long. I think this might be a race to see whose builders burn out faster. Whichever faction has their builders quit first are probably going to be the ones that lose, honestly. We could actually see nukes play a more vital role in this war as well, which I'm excited for. One thing I didn't touch on in this video is what a nerf these changes have been for partisans. Almost anything a partisan destroys can now easily be replaced. Partisans, how are you doing out there this war? I hope to see some more love for partisan play in future updates. Let's face it, we have all complained at one point or another how this game does not respect our time. I feel like these changes have given us more time back. Have they taken more time away in terms of frontline battles? Possibly, but frontline battles and moving territory from one faction to the other is the name of the game. This is where the time should be spent, not gathering and not making equipment. I should know, I still want players to gather and I still want equipment to take some time to build. But I would rather have stalemate battles where players are actually fighting one another with tanks and artillery than stalemate battles where they're fighting against AI defensive structures. Gameplay is overall faster and more mobile now than it's ever been, and I love it. Now, War 112 is the first war with these changes, so it may be too soon to do any harsh judgments, or even say that things are better. I'm honestly curious to see how the next 2 or 3 wars go with these changes. Overall, right now, I think the changes have produced more of a net positive than negative effects. I'm not saying that it's perfect. Certainly, there are still changes that need to be made, but overall, the changes have been good. What are your thoughts on the current economy of Foxhole? Do you like these facility changes, or do you think they need to be reworked again? Let me know in the comments. Shout out to WLL Winter Legion Logistics for helping me with this video. WLL is a great logistics clan that is mainly Colonial but go Warden from time to time. If you want to join an extremely experienced, friendly, and chill logistics group, I would recommend joining WLL. I've linked their Discord in the description below. Tell them I sent you. Thank you all so much for watching and for your support. Make sure to subscribe for more Foxhole content. Make sure to fill your BMAT and EMAT queues today. Cheers.